Okay.
And just know that you can always, if you miss a class, you can always come and watch the recording, either from this session or from the one on Wednesdays. Karen puts both of those up every single week. All right. Bishop Spong asked us to look beyond in amazing ways. And we like comfort. We like what we know. We sometimes like to be encapsulated in the comfortable. And a lot of what Bishop Spong is doing with his books are challenging us. So specifically today, we're going to look at God. And the good news is I know God is a really big topic, so we've given it 2 weeks to be able to fix it all.
Oh, that's good. That ought to be, he did it in 7 days, didn't he?
So if we don't finish today, it's okay. What I'm going to suggest that we do is that we kind of do like what he did. Bishop Spong seems to take it in 2 pieces. He tries to tell the story of and the history of how we got here and what's changed things around us. So that's what I suggest we do for tonight's class, is kind of look at what is it that is the difficulty, the challenge. And then next week, what are the solutions, either that Bishop Spong shows to us or that that we're thinking on our own. The hard part is that he has lots of things that he has figured out that's what he's going to do. You and I may not be in exactly the same place, because all of us grew up in some kind of mindset around religious things, around world things, and we have to figure out how much of that to hold on to and how much of it to let go of. So, for example, my upbringing, Mormonism, is centered around a story of Joseph Smith struggling with which church was right. And so he went out into this place in upstate New York that we colloquially call the Sacred Grove. And he prayed, and all of a sudden 2 people came down from heaven and stood before him, God the Father, God the Son, right? And they spoke to him and said, none of the churches are true, but through you will restore the true church. And so that idea of God in man form is very strong within my background. And so I have to choose very deliberately to think differently than that, because that's what I heard and preached and spoke about and listened to for decades. What are the images you have inside of you? And specifically tell us about which images don't seem to work for you anymore, which ones don't fit into where you're at right now. And it doesn't mean you completely let go of them, but that those are the ones that you're working on. So what are they for you?
Well, for me, it's that mighty warrior God. We seem very, very focused on the God who showed up and won the battle, that Jehovah Sabaoth, leading the charge kind of thing. And that is kind of hard to let go of, because in a sense, because this was the one fighting your battles for you. Right. And when you let that go, and it doesn't work for me, though. I mean, if you're talking about a God who loves all, that kind of God won't fit. Yeah. But then if you go, it makes you responsible now. Yeah. to work your own way through life. Yeah.
I remember I was probably 10, 11, 12 years old, lustily singing with my buddies that song about it just slipped right out of my head. The Mighty Warrior song, Onward Christian Soldiers.
Christian Soldiers, oh yes.
Right? And just really enjoying that. And just that experience, singing along with my buddies, makes it so that even though I know that I don't want to sing that song, man, that felt good when I was 12.
Yeah.
Right?
That camaraderie,
that strength in that, in what that meant to us at that point. And yet you're right, that warrior God does not fit into my theology at all.
Mm-mm.
How about the rest of you?
Well, actually, emotionally for me, it's this God that demands perfection. And I left just real briefly. I had two Mormon ministers come to me, and it presented a challenge to me because either the Baptist church that I was in had all the truth, or they had all the truth. And that was one of the things that helped to, in the metaphor, actually break down the walls that I had built up, and move on. But it's that for me, it's that God that demands perfection. And even now, I'm still struggling with if I can't be perfect.
Yeah.
Or no matter what I do, it doesn't matter because you can never be good enough.
Yeah. And the hard part about that is that every religious body of any sort has some definition of that perfect. What do you do? How do you move that direction? And it's hard not to have that. That's at least part of what you're trying to define, is what is the right path? What is the right way of being? I'm not certain those are the best questions, but that's what we ask again and again. And so I got to tell you that there's one thing that Mormons and Baptists agree on. Did you know that? Just one thing that I know of, at least. And that's that they both can't be right. Because they're pretty sure, both of them, that they have the right answer. So, yes, that's a good one, Ron. Thank you. What else?
So what do you do when you tell somebody in church, I'll pray for you?
Yeah, that word, that phrase, I'll pray for you, has been often, it's a struggle because of the way it's used. It sometimes is used almost as a weapon, right? I've got the power and you don't, so I'll invoke God on you. And it can be used other than that as well, but when it essentially assumes truth here, not truth out there, then it can be really troublesome, can't it? Yeah. Anything else that you struggle with and or reject from the images of God in your past?
Well, to follow that further, it's if someone prays for you or you pray. So like I prayed to not be anxious, and the more that I prayed, the worse I got.
Yeah.
And then comes the whole shame. It's like, you're doing something wrong, or so.
Yeah, and some of those definitions of what to do: pray a little bit harder and it'll work more. Go on a longer fast. Whatever it happens to be, that more devotion will somehow make God love you more, which is of course one of the big things that Spong deals with in this theistic God that he's imagining, because that's the big evil that he sees in our makeup of God, theistic God. And by that, well, let me just give you his definition. Understanding God in theistic terms as a being, supernatural in power, dwelling somewhere external to the world and capable of intervening in the world with miraculous power, is no longer believable. Most God talk in liturgy and conversation has thus become meaningless. What we must do is find the meaning to which the word God points. A new way to speak of God must be found. And specifically the line where it says, most God talk in liturgy and conversation has thus become meaningless. That's because much of that talk is about how to appease, how to come close to, how to make God like you, if you will. And ultimately, think about what that's saying about that God. It's not, I don't know, maybe that works for some people, but ultimately that's not saying much about the strength of that God.
It's almost capricious.
Uh-huh.
what I recall,
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
well, yeah, what I recall from my early experience as an Episcopalian, and you know, they are sort of,
Episcopalian church can be wrong too.
Could never spell it.
Sorry, Ann, I interrupted.
oh, no problem. I didn't know whether I was coming through or not.
You are.
But it seems to me that Episcopalians are kind of the opposite of Baptists maybe, or Mormons, because they don't get particularly spiritual, but nevertheless, faith was supposed to be so important. And in other words, you had, in my view, I had to try to believe even if I didn't believe. And so the harder you would try, the harder I would try, the better I would think I would be. And a better Christian I would be if I would just try harder to believe. And finally, that's kind of how I drifted away in college, because I started to engage my brain more. And, you know, now what appeals to me about Spong and the few books of his that I've read is, and maybe for you too, the same, that, you know, he really does ask you to think about what all this means.
That's right.
Not just take it on faith, but think about what really makes sense in a rational way. And that's so opposite, I believe, to many religions that I know something about, although I didn't grow up with them. You know, that you're not supposed to really question or engage your intelligence too much. You're supposed to have faith.
Yeah.
That's
And
right.
so the whole question of faith always, you know, I tried to adhere as a child, but later on, it just didn't make sense at all to me.
And here's two observations that I made in my growing up. First of all, I literally think I knew all the answers to all the questions that were regularly asked in Mormonism by the time I was 12. And I don't mean that as an exaggeration, because I think we rehearse and recover the same ground over and over and over again. And we really don't teach more, we teach the same over and over. So we think we're having Bible study classes, but we're really just rehearsing rather than truly thinking. And you're right, that's a sad commentary if that's all we're doing. If we're asking people to step beyond, to think, to bring up new insights, to drag the rest of us somewhere we haven't been, that's a whole different process.
Yes.
But that's a scary process because it leaves church out of control. And that's at least part of where Bishop Spong is very concerned here, is that much of the work that goes into God thought in a lot of churches is about how do I use it to say I'm the right answer and you have to listen to me.
Yeah. But in fairness, I think it's a modern process as well, because it's only been since modern times that we've had the ability as individual people to take whatever sacred scripture or to take whatever scientific thing or look around and recognize that there's more to it than that, because we have the ability to reach out and get information on our own, where before that wasn't the case. You didn't have that ability.
Yeah, and I hope you got that specifically from the reading. I don't know which books you read, but if you read Why Christianity Must Change or Die, he goes through Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, right? And says, here's how these different wonderful thinkers took us beyond what the Bible could do.
Yeah. To bring us to here.
To bring us to here. And so we are in a unique place to be able to now think and move differently than what our predecessors could.
Although I would say that some predecessors, especially indigenous people, have had a much different theology way before. I mean, Christianity got bastardized early in the 3rd century. So it's like, even before that, it wasn't the same religion.
Right.
So it's only become dogmatic after that. But for me, I know, like I've shared before, I wasn't really churched early in my life. So I have pamphlets from my grandmother that I learned about Jesus, and Jesus was about love. So to me, that's what Christianity was. Jesus was love, and he accepted, and he took care of the poor. It was all about people who were the underdogs, and he was always for the underdogs. And that's like where my affinities lay my whole life. I never did understand the concept of God. To me, God was always, I remember telling a preacher at my grandmother's church when I was in high school that I thought he was creating God in his image. Because I just think we've always created God in our image.
Mhm.
And so that's just the way I've always understood how God was always like this peeping Tom, who was a judging peeping Tom who looked in your windows to see what you were doing, and then judged you if you were going to heaven or hell or something, and that just never fit with me. So I've never really understood this whole concept of.
Kind of like Santa Claus there. You had that list and you're checking it
Yeah,
twice
that's what-
to see.
That's what it said in there in his book too.
Yeah.
The one thing that Spong said that I had to write down is God is not a noun that needs to be defined. God is a verb that needs to be lived.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
and that
Describes God more succinctly to me than anything else I've read in a long time.
and that was that in the last 25 years has been one of my biggest learning. That's a very processed thought learning space.
Yeah.
And people like John Cobb helped me to learn that. But we'll get to that more later, because that's more of the solution. Where do we go and how do we help people to be able to think differently? I want to spend just a little bit more time here and see if anybody else has images that they've worked to move beyond.
I just wanted to bring up that sometimes it's beyond thought, because those experiences I've had of the ineffable, which aren't very often, and they come at odd moments with, I got saved at a Billy Graham crusade, and I could look back at that and see how emotions are whipped up. But that experience, and I think Spong says often, we've had the experience is real, the explanation differs.
Yeah.
And sometimes I don't know if there ever is an explanation. It could be just chemicals.
Yeah.
But because I'm very rational, but the words we use to define things can never they point to a reality. They can't be the reality itself.
So at least part of the reason why we get in the space where we're at, though, of churches essentially designing a way to move people and control people. And I don't want to take it out of that mode, but at least part of the reason why we get there is because sometimes we are not trustworthy, because as we have those moments like you spoke of, Ron, we don't understand them well, but we sometimes give them a definitiveness that we try to apply to everyone. This happened to me, and so it has to happen to you.
For you, yeah.
And so churches sometimes, because of that, which could scatter us, try to bring back to an essence what's happening here, and try to tell us, no, this is what has to be done. And so it's not always bad controlling that's happening, but it's controlling all the less.
You have to stay a member of the group.
Yeah, that's the hard part about all of this, is it's both the individual moving and the group trusting the individual and not squelching the individual, but also the individual listening to the group in some way, right? Because if I have an experience of God, then that doesn't necessarily make me the prophet of the whole world and everyone has to listen to me. But we often kind of put ourselves in that mode.
So do you leave the Bible in your library and you just walk to church without the Bible? How's that?
Yeah. There's a bunch of people who walk to church with the Bible and leave the Bible at home anyway.
Yeah,
If you know what I mean, because what
I
they
do.
carry is what they think the Bible says. I had a conversation this week on Facebook with a man named Jesse Long. He goes by, on Facebook, he goes by Brother Jesse Long. Which I think is a bit pretentious. But he is a pastor in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. You can guess his theology.
Yep.
And we were discussing hell. And I think human beings invented hell. That's my basic take on that. But he thinks that it's all over the Bible and God had ordained it and God, wants that to be there. I think that we have hell so that we can place each other in it. Right? When we can't figure out
it's not under the bed, huh?
Yeah. And so we had quite a struggle to try to he didn't like my answers. It wasn't overly.
I don't know why.
But the hard part is this: all of us are going to have to deal with people like Brother Jesse Long, right? And somehow we have to find ways to have conversations. So as you listen to this conversation and as you say, this is how I've moved, this is what's helped me, also listen to how maybe some of your conservative and traditional folks are going to be hearing it, to try to hear how you might be able to be in conversation with them differently. Not because you're going to fix them or because you're hoping they fix or they're going to fix you, but so that you try to, as much as possible, make them as profitable a conversation as you can.
Mm-hmm.
Well, aren't there different, because we have, this is one of the perceptions. This is somehow the Bible came down. And I think as Spong said, fully formed in verses and chapters and in the King James Version.
Yeah.
But instead there's is it Sheol, the Hebrew understanding. It's kind of like the Greek understanding. It's sort of even a literary device. It's sort of a shady.
Yeah.
And
even if it's a real place, it is not a place anything like the hell that we define it as. And I should say this, Ron, hell in the Bible is at best a minor doctrine. It's not very prominent at all, in my mind at least. And in most cases, I think it's even less than a minor doctrine. But a lot of people elevate it really highly. They also elevate devil really highly. You know why? Because those are good ways to be able to control and motivate.
Absolutely. I mean, if I can control your afterlife, because none of us knows what happens once we close our eyes for the last time. I mean, let's be real. If I can, then I can control you in this life. And while not all of the things that I think the church set up were intentional, like you pointed out, were intentionally bad, I don't think so at all. I think they were guardrails kind of put in place to keep us from going off the deep end. That one in particular for me was a definite control mechanism to make sure that you towed the right line. And I really don't even think the majority of people, even the people who talk about hell, believe in hell. Because if you really believed in hell, I mean, that was going to be your future, you'd act a whole lot different in this world. I mean, you would see a lot more niceness, a lot more good things.
And not the really believe of each other over the head with the concept,
right?
Which is often what happens. It's like I'm going to hit you until you believe in heaven. Well, what sense does that make?
Jim, I can kind of see where you would want to have conversations with other people about different religions and theologies and stuff. But personally, I see absolutely there's no way I'm going to do that anymore, because my best friend is well, she's a liberal Christian, but she very much believes in heaven or hell. She very much believes, in fact, I asked her one time, I said, if there was no heaven or hell, would you be a Christian? And she said, no. And we've tried to discuss theology a few times. And finally, she just told me, she said, it makes me very uncomfortable when we talk about this.
Yeah.
And I respect her enough that I'm not going to push my beliefs on her.
Yeah.
And she's not going to push, she doesn't believe she doesn't believe in Darwin's theories or anything, and I'm not, it hurts her too much to even debate it. So, and to me, there's no point in it, because you're not going to change them. And they're not going to change my beliefs.
Yeah. I'm actually, Judy, not really asking you to have conversations. I'm asking you to be in a space where you try to hear how it is that why they're holding on to what they hold on to. So that, because at some point she may come up to you and say, tell me more about that we talked about 3 weeks ago, 3 months ago, 3 years ago. And you want to be able to hear what the struggle is in her soul. I'm not saying that you'll ever have that conversation, but you want to be in that space where, why is it that people are holding on to heaven and hell? Why is that important to them? Why is it that they're holding on to their concept of God, whatever that concept is, and by extension, their concept of how Spong is challenging that. Susan, wasn't it you who was telling me about talking to your Episcopal priest friend?
It's muted.
Yes, it was.
Do you mind sharing that story with everyone?
Sure. I have a good friend that's an Episcopal priest, and I was kind of excited about letting her know that we're going to be studying song and what we're going to be doing. And she texted me back, and I was just shattered. I was just shocked, because she said that she doesn't like him. He's too far out for her. She's surprised that he's still a minister. He's still in the church. And I just really surprised, because I like Jim and I like her. And you guys had a total diametrical view of the particular person and his views.
And this is a person that you think is relatively liberal and,
yes, yes,
and trying to do as good as, and so,
right.
but for some reason, what Spong says is challenging to her,
right,
beyond where she wants to go.
And I can't wait to talk with her a little bit about it. Well, not talk, but listen to her and find out more about why she feels that way. And like you said, what she's holding on to, what she's unable to, kind of let go of, and what are some of the challenging things that he has to say that she doesn't buy into.
So I guess that's part of why I said that, Judy, is not to fix them, not to have the conversations, but to be able to try to understand them. And if they need a conversation, if they want a conversation, to have that, to not be fearful of it. I don't think that we have to. I did enough converting in my Mormon years, right? I don't have to convert everyone to the right answer. In fact,
So are you going to go around now and apologize to all those people you converted?
oh yeah, I should. The thing of it is I don't think it's wrong to convert people necessarily. I just think that it's not quite God.
You're right.
If I have
It's way not quite God.
Yeah, one of the lines that I loved out of here is where he said something along the lines of, each of us worships a slightly different God.
Yeah.
And he says that in a way that it's not a judgmental way, because what he's doing is he's saying none of us has a perfect right view of how to understand this infinite being called God, right? And even using the word being is not right. It's something.
It's a verb.
Yeah, it's a verb, and we're going to get to that. That's one of the best things, isn't it? That idea of verb that moves us rather than a human being, right? As soon as we put a noun on it, then we almost have to put a face on it.
I'm
Yeah.
not sure I agree with that. I've heard this and read this before, that God is not so much a noun as a verb. And I've heard people say, I God you, or something like that. And, I'm sorry, I can't grasp that, but I certainly can think about God as a force,
Yeah.
certainly not as a personification of something with a face,
Yeah.
but as a force, and a living force that possibly we all can co-create. We can get to that, I'm sure, later, but I don't know if I'm stuck, but I really sense God as a force.
Yeah.
A living force.
And I think when I say God as verb, I think that's what I mean. Somebody called God the prime mover,
Mhm.
which is a noun, but I think they meant by that which continually helps others to move,
Mhm.
continually changes things around so that we could continually are kept to take us out of our stasis and move us.
Unfettered.
Mhm.
Does that make sense? And I think when I say God as a verb, that's what I mean by it, is that God moves rather than God talks, acts like a human being.
Mhm.
If that makes sense.
Mhm. Sure.
Well, the hard part is that even in this, two little words, verb, noun, it's complicated.
Yeah.
And yet we put a definitive on words all the time that are trying to describe something that's not definitive. Right? Go ahead, Sam.
Okay, so Anne says she can't get along with I God you. And I agree with that. How about I love you?
Mhm.
If God is love, as I would choose to say that,
Mhm.
love, if God is a love, if that's the spirit, then the password to these Zoom meetings is called love. That's pretty good. You don't have to put it down God, you can just say love.
Yeah. And the hard part though, Sam, is that anything we do, because I agree, God is love. That's one of my best ways to be able to understand God. But even that can have difficulties because there's different ways to love. And
Mhm.
what I really like to be loved is all the ways that are nice to me,
Yeah.
right? That I appreciate in that moment. Some of the love that my wife has given me hasn't been quite so accepted appreciatively. And I know it's given in love, and I know it's lovingly, it's a loving act. But you know what I'm saying? Love is a challenge. And so it doesn't always fit what I want it to be. And that's the difficulty. And when we say, like, I think it was Judy, it was you maybe who said it, that we that our God will always look like us. It's because we don't know how not to do that.
Mhm.
Mm.
That's what we have to live out of. But we can continually try to step beyond just that. And you know how we do that is by listening to each other.
Mhm.
And by hearing something that my mind can't quite see by itself. But suddenly in Anne's mind, she takes me a step beyond myself.
Mm.
I think a part of that though starts with, for me, the biggest part of it started with contemplation, not with discussing it with others, but with going deep within myself.
Yeah.
And finding meaning and sacredness inside of me and what that meant
Yeah, yeah.
before I was able to discuss it with others.
Yes.
Yeah, but what
And-
you're talking about, Judy, is the two different ways that we could expand ourselves. One is the depth element. Are we willing to go into that deep spot and try to hear more than just the surface where we sit most of the time? But also it's that breadth of going beyond ourselves that way. And both of those are important, because if I only sit in this space, this relatively shallow, relatively narrow space, if I essentially build walls around me, which is comfortable, but suddenly I'm stuck. And at least part of what God is, especially if we use a term like prime mover, God is always about us going somewhere. It's not a static space, but a dynamic space. And that can be deeper, and that deeper can draw me forward. It can be wider, and that breadth can draw me forward or backwards, or whichever direction it needs to draw me, right?
I don't say it stops with contemplation, but for me, it had to start there.
Yeah, no, I think that's, yeah. And sometimes where it has to start is because of where you came from, that only that what was the, this isn't quite the right word, but what was the dysfunction that got you stuck somewhere? Does that make sense? What was the narrowing space? For me, like I said, I knew all the right answers by 13. And so I had that idea of, look how good I am, I'm right. And that made it so I didn't have to think any longer about. And so where it had to draw me was into a relationship with the divine that made it so that I couldn't say I knew everything.
I don't think I've ever had that feeling of feeling like I knew everything, Jim.
No, what I'm saying, that was my dysfunction that I had to.
No, I know, I'm saying you did.
Yeah.
I'm maybe a little envious or something. I never had that feeling.
No.
I always thought everything was such a mystery that I
Yeah.
But
never.
remember, he was talking about when he was 12 years old.
Yeah.
We're-
Yeah.
When I
Work
was
with-
12, I really was so, I won't even go there, but
Yeah.
it wasn't any place that I felt like I knew anything.
Yeah, but see but that's the other thing though, is maybe your dysfunction, if we continue using that word, is that you're in that space continual of mystery, and there has to be a certain amount of empowerment of you, Judy, that you can connect to and have answers about God. I don't know. I don't want to put words into your head or into your heart. What I'm saying is that God for me will always draw us from wherever we're at and towards something that is healthier, better than just what we designed by ourselves.
Yeah.
If we open ourselves to it.
Mhm.
I should put that caveat on it, because a lot of religion, the dysfunction of religion is it says, here's everything there is. This is all you have to do. And that's true about any religion in all different ways. And sometimes one religion has become this thing in reaction to that religion, and maybe vice versa. And somehow the better thing is to let that new voice draw me beyond. And so in my conversation with Brother Jesse Long, my hope would always be that both of us are better after the conversation.
Mhm.
He sees the threat too much. And so I don't think he ever completely enters into the conversation with me. And I don't mean to be threatening. I truly don't try to be threatening, but that's what I think he feels.
Jim,
Yes.
I was wondering, when he said to you, well, hell's in the Bible, or how did you respond?
I
I hear,
try to
I
be
hear that a
honest.
lot, and I don't know how to respond. Like,
Yeah.
so I
I
was
tried-
wondering how you respond.
Yeah, I try to be honest about how I see things differently. Okay, give me a second. I can show you, I can pull up stuff so I can tell you specifically some of it, but it's something like when he says, well, you've got to agree that this is there. What I try to do is say, this is how I see this, because I have a high sense of what Old Testament was doing, but not the same high sense that he has. He thinks that what happened in the Old Testament, it was essentially God spoke the exact words to the prophets, they wrote them down.
Right.
I think it was men and women that were trying very hard to hear that divine voice and lead people in a direction, and they did the best job they could at writing something down, but that it wasn't necessarily definitive for all ages. And so rather than just accept that, of course, everyone heard God in exactly the way that Jesse Long thinks, I try to say, but there's another way that maybe you can view this.
Mhm.
If that makes sense.
So what do you say when you go to the hospital and it's a person you don't necessarily know, and he says to you, pray for me, not
say a prayer.
with me?
Yeah, I say a prayer. I say a prayer for that
Mhm.
person. I also don't necessarily myself need to say a prayer at the end of it, because oftentimes hospital visits are marked by pastor comes in, we talk for a few minutes, and you say a prayer and you leave. Now that prayer at the end, I don't believe is the real prayer. I think the real prayer is when we're talking before we do whatever that is at the end.
That's right.
Right? And
Yeah.
so if someone asks me to do a prayer, I'll say a prayer. I'll say the words of prayer. Right? But I don't think that's where the strongest portion of what I do healing wise is in a hospital visit.
That's right.
Yeah, I bet.
If that makes sense.
Absolutely. Being there
Mhm.
and listening and being present and conveying love, all of that, I believe, is a prayer.
Yeah, that's right.
Mhm.
And I think that listening and trying to hear what it is this person needs. Because I think I've told you before, and we'll get more about this weeks down the way when we talk about prayer. I think I've told you before that my concept of prayer is very, very different than what I was taught growing up. And how Bishop Spong sees it is much more in the action than in the words.
Mhm.
But if this person needs words, that if
Yeah.
I'm in prayer with that person, then I need to hear that he or she needs the words, and I need to speak words in order for them to feel the prayer that they need to feel as well.
Yes, sure.
But that means it's got to be a very dynamic and relational space. But in a real sense, that's what we're talking about with God, because much of what we've done with God is say God is this. And it may be a huge box that we make, but we say God is this and only this.
Mhm.
And at least part of what God is for me is way beyond this.
Yeah.
Right? Part of my God is whatever, you see me within this box, but part of my God is over here where my hand now is.
Yeah.
You can't see it all.
Yeah.
And at least part of my invitation would be, can I help you to see what I can see, but you can't see? Can I help you to understand and be open to you doing the same thing to me?
Yeah.
Right? As one of the things about Zoom is that we get to see each other's backgrounds, right? Which we don't get to do all the time. And so suddenly we get to ask questions of, hey, what's that picture back there?
Mhm.
What's that mean to you? And we get to see a little further into each other's lives. And I think at least part of this pursuit of God is trying to do that. isn't it?
Sure.
And the hard part is that it's as multifaceted and as broad and deep as there are people.
Mhm.
And so it's a more than lifetime pursuit.
Mm.
And that leaves us to some degree dissatisfied.
Really? See, I find that the most satisfying part, the fact that it's a journey. Like as soon as I feel like I have the answer, then you become static, you become fossilized. I love the fact that there's never, I don't think I'm ever going to be certain about it, but I love, what I'm loving is the journey and the learning and the talking with other people about it and where they come from and develop and reading people and learning more and just things that just blow my mind, that just send me into another realm. That's
Right.
I so love this journey I'm on.
Right. And I agree with you. And I think that's where we're taking this. Problem is that how many like to finish a book, like to finish making a cake, like to finish. That's what I'm talking about. And in this, the finishing of any project is just the starting of the next one.
The next, yeah.
Does that make sense? And so it's like a non-ending book. And there's a certain amount of where we like the satisfaction of finishing. That's what I meant by that. But you're right, it's an ongoing pursuit. And that's a good thing. That's what I think that's what we want to do. Our models in religion haven't always encouraged us to do that. Our models say, get to the bottom of God and get there quickly and then tell everyone else that you're right. Right? Too often that's been the model, isn't it?
I remember talking to my dad one time and we were discussing God and I said, I just don't know what I really think. And he looked at me and I'm like 18 years old. And he looks at me and he goes, well, my God, you better figure it out pretty fast. I was like, whoa, okay. That was the wrong answer, apparently.
Well, and we do have some immediacy about that, especially when we look at, like you mentioned death earlier, we don't know what lies beyond death. And so we've often used death as that thing of, you better figure out before you die.
Right.
Because
Well,
you
'cause
don't
you're
have
gonna
any
go to hell
chance
if you don't.
afterwards. And we don't know that. But we put those immediacy things on to us in ways that maybe are not appropriate.
Mm.
Because if Ron needs to take a slower, more, winding path, is that a wrong path? But it's not the straight and narrow way that I was taught about growing up in Mormonism.
Yeah.
The only way you can have a straight and narrow way is if you're on flat ground.
Yeah.
You can never go up like that.
Yeah. You can try.
But the road up the hill always winds.
Yeah.
It never goes, you never go straight up the hill.
But we don't. Go ahead, Ron.
I was just going to bring up, as a hiker, I use a metaphor of the trail. You're going on a trail and it twists and turns and you don't know why until you get to the top and you can look down and see where you're going.
Yeah.
And why you're going that way.
Yeah, and sometimes if you're hiking, all of a sudden the trail takes a turn off to the left, and you don't know why until you get a little bit further and you see there's a big granite wall in front of you, right? And you needed to go around that wall somehow.
Yeah.
And the truth of the matter is getting directly from point A to point B may not be the best or the only way to get there. Maybe there's a really good, important reason why you need to wander. Maybe looking at the flowers in the field is more important than getting to the top of the mountain. For a number of different reasons, right?
Mhm.
But that means that I have to trust you more than what sometimes we're much more than what we sometimes want to do. We're not predisposed to sometimes trust each other.
Pre-programmed.
Yeah.
This is
But at
going
least-
to be a good class.
Yeah, but at least part of
Yeah.
what we're going to do in here is try to figure out how to help each other continue to move, continue to not get stuck. And we're going to talk about some of the ways that we don't do that. Like, do you remember the story that he told? I loved how he described the rainbow in the Noah story. Did you guys read that part? I think it was in Why Christianity Must Change or Die. Did you read that?
The rainbow of what?
Okay, I think it was, let me just look, I have a note here. Okay, so in chapter 3 of Why Christianity Must Change or Die, he talks about the rainbow that comes out after Noah comes out of the ark.
Oh, yeah.
Remember that story, right? And says, this is the promise that he'll never do this again, that God will never do this again. But he also talked about how it was also God, the great warrior, putting down his bow, his magnificent weapon, and says, I'm not going to use the weapon against you any longer. I just love that image. It's just a great way of being able to think of that beyond just the junior Sunday school promise that we sometimes give of I'm not going to rain on you anymore. But at the same time that I'm reading that, I couldn't help remembering the meme that I put up 3 or 4 weeks ago, a tweet from somebody who said, the rainbow belongs to God, you gays give it back. Because we naturally go into some of those oppositional modes, and it can only be this much. And at least part of what we have to do in this conversation is allow it to be more. One of for me, the dynamics of where we're sitting right now has to do with our definition of me. As I look at back in history, it's a continually expanding definition of who is me. At one point, I was the solitary hunter, way back in the somewheres back, but I learned that having a tribe around me helped me to feel safer and get tasks done that I couldn't do all by myself. And so I began defining the me as my tribe. Later on, a town or a state or a country. But if you'll notice, all of those me's, even as they're expanding, were always in opposition to something. It was me against the bear that's going to attack me. My tribe me against the other tribe down the way. My state me that has to have more force economically than the other, right? My nation that has to have more nuclear weapons than Russia against. And we've gotten to a point where the next expansion is all of us and we don't have an against. And it would be simpler if aliens suddenly attacked, because then we would have a reason to bind us all together against something. But how many are pretty sure that might not happen?
Unless they came and they were coming with love and not attacking.
Yeah. So
that would really shake us up.
Yeah. So at least something that we're having to figure out is, can we define me as all of us without something to be against? And so for me, that's at least part of how does God help us? How does God become that great connector of all of us in some way or another?
What is it? He said, I am who I am.
I am who I am.
And well, right now we are stuck with the real threat of climate change. And that is both separating us and bringing us into, I think, scary times, but still lies that possibility that we're going to move beyond that.
Yeah.
And that's
isn't
the scary thing about these times.
Yeah. And isn't it sad that some of those things that could draw us together, like how do we protect this world that we all need to live? How do we why doesn't that bring us together? But instead, at least in the United States, it has polarized us. How has a disease that has killed so many millions of us become something that has divided us rather than brought us together?
Mhm.
I think those are the types of questions that ultimately I want the God discussion to help us figure out. What do we do so that we do so that somehow we move towards a better sense of all that as individuals here and as this small community, but also how do we help the whole of the world take some steps that way?
I was going to bring up the awful thing about the video that I think it's Paul Gosar let out, was that it was him fighting against these evil hordes of immigrants.
Yeah.
That of course were being led in by AOC and Biden.
Yeah.
And yet, and so that part of the problem with all of our religion is that we get tribal.
Yeah.
And we see the threat of the other.
Yeah.
And it brings up our worst. And then on the other hand, there's that part of religion that has said that goes and sees the Samaritan, sees what we define as enemy as ourselves. Or we see the humanity in people that have been defined outside.
But that's a much more challenging route than
Yes.
some of what we've done. Because the reason why hell is really important in this discussion is because that means that God doesn't have to save us all. Hell means that it's okay for some people, for me to hate some people because they're going to receive God's eternal punishment, and so it's okay for me to hate them now. And it's an easy excuse rather than the much more difficult thing of how do I love Deborah even though she's a pain in the. You know what I'm saying? And whoever
Yeah.
that person is for you, how do I step into relationship with that other person?
Yeah, how do I find compassion for them?
Yeah.
How do I find a modicum of interest in how they think?
Yeah.
How do they think? What do they fear? What do they fear? What do they want
Yeah. Yeah.
with their heart?
And how does that help me to listen to the real them rather
Yeah.
than whatever it is that I see as the wart on the nose? You know, the
Yes.
thing that I see very easily as ugly and reason to reject.
Yeah.
The good news is that we don't have to solve this today. We still have one more week to be of God. All right. Next week.
One more week to figure it out.
Next week, I have to tell you that I am going to be eating turkey instead of talking to turkeys.
Oh, pie.
And so we won't have class next week. Read all those things ahead of time. And so that if you haven't read them, just keep reading, and we'll talk about God more. And we'll talk more and more about how do we move towards those solutions. And they can be Bishop Spong's solutions, or they can be your own, right? As we try to figure out the next steps and what do we do. So I look forward to all that. I will also somewhere in this next week send you all of the readings to come. Okay, for the next section on Christ, because if you look at your paper that has all the 12 points,
I can hardly wait.
there's a bunch of chapters, but there's also a bunch of whole books. Okay, you don't have to read all the whole books, right? Judy might. She's pretty good at reading all the whole books. But
Yeah.
if you want to borrow any of those, I shouldn't say you can borrow all of them because somebody else might have borrowed one, but I have a whole bunch of those books. Like, here's this Hebrew Lord, which is one of them that I put on there. And so you can borrow my books. You just have to come in and just look at them. Okay. So they're either going to sit right behind me, or I have a bag that's sitting on the floor, and you can just look through them and find whatever you want to. Okay.
Would you mind, the part where you had the book, the books and chapters to read for each
Yes.
part. I don't seem to have that for some reason. I think, and I thought I had saved it to notes, but I only saved the first chapter and the second chapter. Would
Okay.
you mind sending that to me again?
I will do that. Yeah, because that's probably the best thing that's going to help guide our
Yeah.
discussion is
Yeah.
all of those readings. So I'll get that to you. And have you gotten
Could
that?
you send them out? Could you send them out to all of us?
Yeah. Do I have your email address, Ann, or is it in the directory?
It should be in the directory.
Okay, then I'll get that. And I think I have everyone else's, but
It's
I'll
not in the paper directory, which is 5 years old, but Melissa has it because I get all the,
oh, good.
all
If
of
Melissa
them.
has it, then I can find it.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. Okay, I'll get that out to you so that you've got that. And I'll send you that, and I'll send you also just the syllabus, which is very, very vague. It's just, here's some different weeks. Okay,
Great.
but at least it gives you an idea.
I've got everything you sent last week.
Okay, and
And I've-
soon I'll send out a whole bunch more chapters, and you can print them all out. Or if you like reading on a computer, you can.
I will. I can mark on it. Happy to do that.
All right, my friends, thank you for your time.
Thanks,
Thank you for your
Jim.
time.
Really
Love
enjoyed
you.
It's good to see
all
you.
your
Thank you.
comments. Thank you.
All right, take care.
So long.
Good night.
Good night.
Night.